Our other topic for this week is rationalism. We're going to look at an overview of what rationalism is, the nature of rationalism. We're going to look at three major rationalists, and we're all going to give an evaluation of rationalism. Rationalism is the idea that knowledge comes from reason alone, largely, if not completely, apart from the senses. Truth is known a priori, that is before, prior, or without experience. Think of the prior and a priori as prior to experience, and not a posteriori, that is after experience or post-experience. Rationalists start with first principles and then want to deduce knowledge from them, which is sometimes called foundationalism. So rationalists are foundationalists in that respect, in that they want to start with first principles as their foundation for all knowledge, and then deduce all knowledge from these first principles. I think that knowledge from these principles must be certain and not probable. So rationalists want to arrive at certainty, and the way they do that is starting in reason alone, not in the empirical sense world, but in reason alone. They want to begin with first principles and then deduce all truth from those first principles, foundationalism, and arrive at truth that is certain, or in philosophical terms, apodictic. And then we need to contrast rationalism with just being rational. So being rational is not the same thing as being a rationalist. A rationalist says that knowledge begins in the mind, over against empiricism, that we'll look at later, that knowledge begins in the senses. So rationalists believe that we don't look to the senses, at least not in large part. Some rationalists will have more of a part for the senses, such as Leibniz. We'll look at him in a few minutes. But this does not mean rational. Rationalists and empiricists want to be rational. Doesn't matter what camp you're in. To be rational just means to have good reasons for believing something. So rationalism is just the notion that all knowledge or truth begins in the mind. We're going to look at several rationalists. We've already looked at a few. We looked at, for example, Plato, who holds to innate ideas, that is, that knowledge is already in the mind because we have observed the forms directly before we were incarnated in this life. And we're going to look at some more modern rationalists. We've already seen Descartes a number of times. You'll remember he rejected the senses. He wanted to find out what can we know that is undoubtable or indubitable. And he says that we can't trust the senses because they can deceive us. We can't tell if we're awake or dreaming sometimes, so we have to start with our mind, start with reason alone, and that is that we think, or that I think, according to Descartes. I think, therefore I am, or the cogito. So the cogito is just the idea that this notion that Descartes came up with, that I think, that's what cogito means, I think, therefore I am, or the cogito ergo sum, or sum. And so Descartes basically just cuts off the senses from his view of philosophy, and he'll want to save the senses in a sense, in a way, because he doesn't want to think that God can deceive us, so God will be his solution to why we can have knowledge of the external world and have senses, but he doesn't want to start there. He wants to start in the mind, and that is what makes him a rationalist. Moving to Benedict Spinoza. All these rationalists are going to be somewhat different in certain ways, but they're all going to hold that knowledge begins in the mind, and they elevate reason over the senses. Spinoza, like a good rationalist, just like Descartes, wanted to make mathematical-like axioms from which he proceeds, and Descartes was much in this same vein. He wanted to start with mathematical-type axioms and then deduce everything from there. So Descartes, like a good rationalist, is a foundationalist. Well, Benedict Spinoza is the same way. He wants to argue for mathematical-like axioms from which he proceeds. He says that truth comes from ideas, and that truth perfectly comes through the perfect idea. In fact, our senses can hinder the intellect. We also can think too abstractly or in general, and there are problems that arise that cause error, but senses can be the cause of that error. But the perfect idea of God is where we should start, that God is a perfect being. He gets this from Anselm. He's heavily influenced by Descartes. He's heavily influenced by the medieval thinker Moses Maimonides, and he is a pantheist. He thinks that God is all that exists, and all that we see for him are modes of God or attributes, but they're ultimately all part of God. So Spinoza, who actually is a Jew, will be a pantheist. He thinks that our perfect idea of God is where we should start, not with the senses, but with the intellect. Hence, Spinoza is one of the great rationalists. We move to Leibniz, another great rationalist who again wanted to move from mathematical formulations. He was mathematical in his methodology. He held to innate ideas that the mind makes or brings up or generates through sense data. So we have innate ideas that are kind of spawned or churned up, if you can say it that way, with the senses. And then the first principles, like we saw earlier, are what we need to base all of our knowledge on. And for Leibniz, the main principle, or the first principle for him, is the principle of sufficient reason, which says that everything that happens for a sufficient reason, or has a reason for why it is or why it exists. In fact, he uses this argument as a proof for God's existence, that all things must have a sufficient reason, and he reasons back to the existence of God. He also holds the principle of non-contradiction and the principle of identity, which you already looked at already. So what about rationalism? Well, there are some good things to be said from rationalism. We want to use first principles, that we do hold to first principles. They are true, but we would argue as empiricists, and when I say we, I mean me and the empiricist tradition, such as Aristotle and Aquinas, that I hold to. These first principles do in fact exist. There are principles about reality, and they're known from reality, but they're known from the senses. That we can't start from the mind and get out to these first principles, because there wouldn't be anything to reason about. I mean, if you cut out all of the material world from our senses in a more radical form, like Descartes and other rationalists, and Leibniz, as we've seen, had a little bit more space for the senses than did thinkers like Descartes. And we'll see in a later lesson that Kant has an aspect of rationalism as well. But if we cut off completely, like a thoroughgoing rationalist wants to, if we cut off completely the external material world, there's nothing to reason about. And so we do have first principles, but those first principles are derived from sense experience and from reality. They're not just principles of reason, they're principles of existence. Something can't be and not be at the same time in the same sense. If something is an apple, per the law of identity, then it's an apple. And so these laws aren't just something that people thought up one day. They're principles of existence. And so we can't cut off existence from these principles. In fact, when Leibniz says that everything has to have a sufficient reason, there's got to be things that have to have a reason for its existence. So we can't just cut off all of material reality. So a full-blown, thoroughgoing rationalism doesn't make any sense. And so there's such principles in are a good test of truth, but they're not a good foundation of truth. Truth ultimately is between our statements and ideas and reality, not just any ideas in and of themselves. It wouldn't even make sense to say that an idea is true if there's nothing for it to be true about. Therefore, we can't deduce reality and knowledge from simply the mind. If we just start in the mind, as we saw Descartes did, we'll never get out to the material world. We'll always be trapped in our mind, hence the mind-body problem. And so the rationalist causes problems that they just really shouldn't cause, and the empiricist doesn't have this kind of problem of trying to get out to the material world. He may have a mind-body problem, depending on how he defines substance, but he doesn't have the problem of trying to get back to the material world. So we cannot deduce reality and knowledge from the mind only. We have to experience it with our senses. Well, rationalism downplays the role of the senses, and needlessly so. It just doesn't seem to make any sense, no pun intended, to downplay the role of the senses. We have a physical body. We don't think we're begging the question to think that we have a physical body and there are physical things around us. If the evidence for the external world just being there isn't good enough to tell us the world is there, then there could never be an argument that could do that. There is no argument that is stronger than our experience of the external world. There's no reason to reject the world of the senses. And we do not believe that there are innate ideas. We're not born with pre-existing notions as Plato thought and as Augustine thought, as being part of that Platonic tradition. But our ideas are formed from our experience of reality. So there are some good aspects of rationalism in that they use first principles, but these first principles are known from the senses and reality, and we cannot deduce reality and knowledge from reason alone. But the use of reason in conjunction with the nature of reality, the sensible world, is a good thing. And so we'll explore the nature of the external world and how we have knowledge of the external world in future lessons.